The chains that bound Marcus Chen were forged from quantum-locked tritanium, each link pulsing with energy fields designed to contain beings capable of tearing apart starships with their bare hands. Yet as he stood in the center of the Grand Tribunal chamber, surrounded by the representatives of 347 different species, the most terrifying thing in the room wasn't the restraints. It was the calm in his eyes. The Galactic Tribunal had never seen anything like it. In their 8,000-year history of dispensing justice across the known galaxy, they had witnessed the pleas of the desperate, the rage of the condemned, and the broken spirits of those who knew their fate was sealed. But they had never encountered someone who stood accused of genocide, yet looked as if he was exactly where he wanted to be. High Arbiter Zixthara, her crystalline form refracting the chamber's ceremonial light into rainbow patterns across the walls, raised her voice to address the assembly. The sound resonated through specialized translation matrices, ensuring every species present could understand the gravity of the moment. We gather today to judge the most heinous crime in galactic history, the systematic elimination of not one, but 7 entire species. Worlds turned to glass, populations numbering in the billions reduced to cosmic dust. The murmur that rippled through the vast chamber was like distant thunder. Representatives from species that had warred with each other for millennia sat side by side, united in their horror at what had allegedly been done. The Veltari delegation, their insectoid forms clicking in agitation, shared space with the gas-dwelling ethereals, while the militaristic Kronex kept their weapon hands conspicuously visible. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. His gaze remained fixed on something beyond the physical boundaries of the chamber, as if he could see through the walls, through space itself, to something that mattered more than the spectacle surrounding him. The accused Zixthara continued, her voice growing harder with each word, stands charged with crimes so vast that we have had to create new categories of justice to encompass them. Marcus Chen of Terra, you are accused of orchestrating the extinction events at Kepler, 442b, Proxima Centauri c, Wolf 359-N, and 4 other worlds. 7 civilizations gone, 43 billion sentient lives ended. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the usual background hum of the station's life support system seemed muted, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Finally, Marcus spoke. His voice was quiet, conversational, as if he were discussing the weather rather than charges that could result in his consciousness being scattered across the void for eternity. 7 worlds, he said, nodding slightly. That's correct. The admission sent a shockwave through the assembly. Guilty pleas were not uncommon, but the casual way he acknowledged such massive destruction was unlike anything in the tribunal's records. Several representatives began speaking at once, their various forms of outrage creating a cacophony that would have been amusing under different circumstances. Zixthara called for order, her crystalline structure flaring brighter. You confess to these crimes? I confess to destroying 7 worlds and every living thing on them, Marcus replied, his tone unchanged. But I don't confess to committing crimes. The distinction seemed to puzzle many in the chamber. The Veltari delegation began their characteristic clicking, while the ethereal's gaseous forms swirled in patterns that indicated confusion among their kind. Explain yourself, demanded Arbiter Kethmore, the Kronex representative whose scarred carapace told the story of 1,000 battles. How can such destruction not be criminal? Marcus turned to face the Kronex directly, and for the first time something flickered in his expression, not fear or regret, but something colder. Something that made several of the more empathically sensitive species in the chamber recoil involuntarily. Because, Marcus said, each of those 7 worlds was guilty of something far worse than mere extinction. They were guilty of a crime so fundamental, so destructive to the very fabric of what we claim to value as civilized beings, that allowing them to continue existing would have been the real atrocity. The chamber erupted. Delegates leaped to their feet, or their equivalent appendages, shouting accusations, demanding proof, calling for immediate execution. The noise was deafening, a mixture of languages, frequencies, and communication methods that the translation system struggled to process. Through it all, Marcus remained perfectly still, waiting. It took nearly 10 minutes for order to be restored. When it was, Zixthar's voice carried a new edge of anger. You dare suggest that entire civilizations deserved extinction? That billions of beings, children, innocents, those who had nothing to do with whatever you believe these worlds did, deserve to die? I don't suggest it, Marcus replied calmly. I state it as fact, and the evidence is standing right here in this chamber. A confusion was palpable now. Even the most experienced legal minds present couldn't follow his logic. How could his mere presence constitute evidence of anything beyond his own guilt? Arbiter Tishan, representing the telepathic Mentari, leaned forward. Her kind rarely spoke aloud, preferring to communicate through direct mental contact, but when they did address others vocally, it was always significant. "Explain your meaning, human. How does your presence here serve as evidence for genocide?" Marcus smiled for the first time since entering the chamber. It was not a pleasant expression, because none of you asked the right question. You've spent months preparing for this trial, gathering evidence, coordinating your legal strategies, and not one of you bothered to ask the most important thing of all. He paused, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. How did I do it? The question hit the chamber like a physical blow. Suddenly, representatives who had been focused on condemnation began to look thoughtful, concerned, even afraid. Because Marcus was right. In all their preparation, they had focused on proving what had happened and establishing his guilt. They had never seriously examined the mechanics of how one human, from a species that had barely achieved interstellar travel, could systematically eliminate 7 advanced civilizations. The humans, Marcus continued, joined your galactic community only 53 years ago. We were barely capable of reaching our own outer planets when you made first contact. Our most advanced weapons couldn't scratch the hull of a basic transport ship. Our understanding of physics was primitive by galactic standards. We were, in every measurable way, insignificant. He began to walk, his quantum restraints automatically adjusting to allow movement while maintaining their containment field. Yet somehow, this primitive human managed to destroy worlds that had existed for millennia, worlds protected by defense systems that could repel entire battle fleets. Worlds with populations in the billions, all of whom had access to technology far beyond anything Earth had ever produced. The murmur that ran through the chamber now was different, nervous, speculative, tinged with the first hints of genuine concern. "How?" Marcus asked again, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the vast space. "How did I do it? Was it through superior technology? Did humanity secretly develop weapons beyond your understanding? Did we build hidden fleets capable of overwhelming your defenses?" He stopped walking and turned to face the assembled delegates directly. "Or was it something else entirely? Something that should terrify every single one of you far more than the death of 7 worlds?" Arbiter Kethmore's scarred carapace clicked as he shifted position. "Tell us how you accomplished this, or we will extract the information from your mind directly." "You can try," Marcus said, his smile widening. "But first, let me save you the trouble. I'll tell you exactly how I destroyed 7 worlds with nothing more than the resources of a single human lifetime." The chamber fell silent again, but this time the quality of the silence was different. It was no longer the silence of judgment being passed, but the silence of predators, realizing they might not be at the top of the food chain after all. "I talked to them," Marcus said simply. The anticlimactic nature of the statement caused another eruption of confused voices, but Marcus raised his hand. Somehow, despite his restraints, the gesture commanded attention. "I talked to them," he repeated. "I learned their languages, studied their cultures, understood their fears and desires and weaknesses. I became their friend. I became trusted. I became beloved. And then, when the time was right, I talked them into destroying themselves." The silence that followed was absolute and profound. Not the silence of confusion or anger, but the silence of beings who suddenly understood that they were looking into an abyss they had never imagined existed. "Impossible," whispered Thisan, her telepathic abilities allowing her to sense the truth in his words even as her rational mind rejected it. No single being could manipulate entire civilizations into self-destruction. No single being of your species could, Marcus agreed. "But I'm human, and we have one advantage that none of you have ever truly understood, despite 53 years of contact with us." He looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes, or optical sensors, or photosynthetic patches, or whatever served for vision, of as many delegates as possible. "We lie better than you tell the truth." The statement hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several delegates began speaking at once, but their words seemed hollow, ineffectual, because deep down, on levels they didn't want to examine, they all knew it was true. Humans were the only species in the galactic community that had evolved from predators rather than prey. They were the only ones who had developed complex social structures based on deception, manipulation, and strategic thinking, rather than cooperation and mutual benefit. They were the only ones who could look another being in the eye and tell them exactly what they wanted to hear while planning their destruction. 7 worlds, Marcus said, his voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality. 7 civilizations that thought they understood the nature of evil. They knew about conquest. They'd been conquered before. They knew about warfare. They'd fought wars. They knew about natural disasters and resource depletion and technological failure. What they didn't know about was a predator that could wear the face of a friend for decades, learning every weakness, every vulnerability, every fear, and then use that knowledge to convince them that their only choice was extinction. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees. Even the environmental controls couldn't compensate for the collective chill that ran through the assembled delegates. The Kepler civilization, Marcus continued, his tone becoming almost conversational again, believed that their greatest strength was their collective decision-making process. Every major choice was made by consensus, with every voice heard and every opinion valued. It took me 11 years to learn their social dynamics well enough to introduce the concept that their population had grown beyond their world's capacity to support them. Another 6 years to convince them that the only ethical choice was voluntary extinction to preserve their planet for future life forms that might evolve there. Several delegates made sounds of horror, but Marcus was just getting started. The Proxima C civilization prided themselves on their logical scientific approach to existence. They had eliminated emotion from their decision-making processes centuries ago, relying entirely on rational analysis. I spent 14 years providing them with carefully crafted data that proved, logically and scientifically, that their continued existence would eventually lead to the heat death of the universe occurring 17 minutes sooner than it otherwise would. For a species that valued logic above all else, the only rational choice was immediate self-termination to prevent this ultimate catastrophe. The ethereal's gaseous forms began to swirl more rapidly, their equivalent of agitation or fear. Their own society was built on logic and reason, and they could see how such manipulation might work on them. Wolf 359. D was interesting, Marcus mused. A warrior culture that valued honor above life itself. I convinced them that their ancestors were watching from beyond death, and that the ancestors were ashamed of how far their descendants had fallen from the old ways. The only path to redemption was to join their forebears in honorable death rather than continue to dishonor their memory through continued existence. Kethmore's carapace began to change color, a sign of extreme emotional distress among his species. His own people valued honor above almost everything else. Each world, Marcus said, required a different approach, a different lie tailored to their specific psychology and cultural values. But the result was always the same. Billions of beings, choosing extinction because they believed it was the right thing to do. He paused, allowing the full impact of his words to settle into the minds of the delegates. And the beautiful thing is, he added, his smile returning, they were all happy when they died. They died believing they had made the right choice, the noble choice, the necessary choice. I gave them the greatest gift any human can give. I let them die feeling good about themselves. The chamber remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of beings who had just realized that their entire understanding of the universe, of good and evil, of the nature of intelligence itself, might be fundamentally flawed. Because if one human could do this to 7 worlds, what could humanity as a whole do to a galaxy? The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the subtle hum of the station's environmental systems and the occasional creak of chitin or scrape of scale as delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The weight of Marcus's revelation had settled over the chamber like a shroud, and for the first time in the tribunal's 8,000-year history, the judges seemed uncertain of their role. High Arbiter Zixthara's crystalline form had dimmed significantly. The rainbow refractions that normally played across her surface reduced to pale, flickering patterns. Her voice, when she finally spoke, lacked its earlier authority. You claim to have manipulated 7 civilizations into self-destruction through deception and psychological manipulation alone? I don't claim it, Marcus replied, his tone still maddeningly calm. I accomplished it. And the proof isn't just in the results. It's in the fact that not one of you has asked the most obvious follow-up question. Arbiter Thyssen leaned forward, her telepathic abilities focused intently on Marcus despite the psychic dampeners built into his restraints. What question? Why am I telling you this? Marcus spread his arms as wide as his quantum bonds would allow, the gesture somehow managing to appear casual despite the lethal energy fields crackling around his wrists. Think about it. I've just confessed to manipulating entire civilizations into extinction. I've revealed methods that could theoretically be used against any of your worlds. I've painted humanity as the ultimate predator species in a galaxy full of prey. So why am I here telling you all of this when I could have simply remained silent and let you execute me for ordinary mass murder? The question hung in the air like a poison gas, and Marcus could see the moment when its implications began to dawn on various delegates. The Veltari delegation's chittering grew more agitated, while several of the more sophisticated AI representatives began running probability calculations that made their optical sensors flicker rapidly. Kethmore, the scarred Kronex warrior, was the first to voice what many were thinking. "You're still lying to us. This entire confession is another manipulation." "Am I?" Marcus tilted his head slightly, a gesture that somehow seemed predatory despite his restraints. "If I'm lying, then what's the truth? That I somehow acquired planet-killing weapons? That humanity has been secretly building an armada capable of overwhelming galactic defenses? That would certainly be more comforting for you to believe." "More comforting than what?" demanded Zixthara. "Than the alternative," Marcus said softly. "Which is that everything I've told you is absolutely true, and I'm here because my mission isn't finished yet." The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop another few degrees. Even species that didn't experience fear in the traditional sense began to display their equivalents of unease. The ethereal's gaseous forms contracted noticeably, while several of the silicon-based life forms in attendance began to emit stress pheromones that their neighbors could detect even through environmental filters. "Your mission," repeated Tissan, her mental abilities straining against the psychic dampeners. "You speak as if the genocide of 7 worlds was merely a preliminary step." Marcus nodded approvingly, as if she were a particularly bright student who had just grasped a difficult concept. "Exactly. 7 worlds were just the proof of concept, the demonstration phase. What I needed to establish before moving on to the real target. Which is..." Zixthara's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. Marcus gestured around the chamber with his chin, his restraints preventing more elaborate movement. "This, all of you, the entire galactic tribunal system, and through it, the power structures that govern 347 different species across 2/3 of the known galaxy." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Delegates leaped to their feet, weapon systems came online with audible hums and clicks, and the chamber's security protocols activated, flooding the space with energy barriers and defensive fields. Through it all, Marcus remained perfectly calm, watching the chaos with the detached interest of a scientist observing a particularly interesting chemical reaction. "Impossible!" Kethmore roared, his warrior's pride overriding whatever fear might have been building in his mind. "No single being could manipulate the tribunal itself. We represent the combined wisdom and experience of hundreds of civilizations. You represent the combined weaknesses and blind spots of hundreds of civilizations," Marcus corrected him gently. "And you've just spent the last hour demonstrating exactly why my plan will work." The security barriers continued to pulse with lethal energy, but gradually, order began to reassert itself. The delegates slowly returned to their seats, though many kept their weapon systems armed and their attention focused on the human who had somehow managed to terrify an entire galaxy with nothing more than words. "Explain," Zixthara commanded, her crystalline structure flaring brighter as she reasserted her authority. "Gladly," Marcus said. "But first, let me ask you something. In your 8,000 years of existence, how many humans have appeared before this tribunal?" The question seemed odd, almost irrelevant, but Zixthara consulted her memory cores. 14. All for minor infractions or civil disputes. Nothing approaching the severity of your crimes. 14 humans in 53 years of galactic membership, Marcus mused. That averages out to about 1 every 4 years. For a species of nearly 12 billion individuals spread across 42 worlds and hundreds of space stations, that's a remarkably low crime rate, wouldn't you say? Humans have proven to be unusually law-abiding galactic citizens, admitted Arbiter Valtheron, a plant-based life form whose species served as record-keepers for the tribunal. Your crime rate is actually the lowest per capita of any species in the galactic community. Interesting, Marcus said. So either humans are naturally more virtuous than every other species in the galaxy, or... He let the implication hang in the air. "Or you're better at not getting caught," Thassan said quietly, her telepathic abilities finally picking up something from Marcus despite the dampeners. Not thoughts or emotions, but something else. Something that felt like vast, patient certainty. "Bingo," Marcus said, and his smile was genuinely pleased this time. "We're much, much better at not getting caught. Because getting caught means we failed, and humans don't like to fail." "You were caught," pointed out Valtherin. "Was I?" Marcus asked. "Or am I exactly where I planned to be from the beginning?" The question sent another ripple of unease through the chamber. Because the more they thought about it, the more the delegates realized how strange the entire situation was. Marcus had made no attempt to hide his identity when destroying the 7 worlds. He had left clear evidence of human involvement. He had practically announced his presence to galactic authorities. For a species supposedly skilled at deception, his capture had been almost suspiciously easy. "You wanted to be captured," Sixthera said slowly. "You wanted to stand trial." "I wanted to address the Galactic Tribunal," Marcus corrected. "This isn't a trial, it's a presentation. And you've all been a wonderfully attentive audience." Kethmore's scarred carapace was now shifting through colors that indicated extreme agitation among his species. "What are you presenting?" "The future," Marcus said simply. "The new reality that humanity is introducing to galactic civilization. You see those 7 worlds I destroyed? They weren't chosen randomly. They were selected very carefully, based on specific criteria." "What criteria?" demanded Thisan. "They were test cases," Marcus explained. Each one represented a different type of civilization, a different psychological and cultural profile that exists among galactic species. Hive minds, logic-based societies, honor cultures, collective democracies, theocratic systems, monarchies, and anarchist communes. 7 different ways of organizing intelligent life. 7 different value systems. 7 different approaches to existence. The implications began to sink in, and several delegates looked around the chamber with new understanding. The tribunal was designed to represent every possible type of civilization in the galaxy. If Marcus had successfully manipulated representatives of each major psychological and cultural type— "You bastard," Thisan whispered, her telepathic abilities finally breaking through enough of the dampening field to sense the true scope of what he was telling them. "You used them to develop a playbook. Each world was a laboratory where you tested different manipulation techniques." "Very good," Marcus said approvingly. "Each civilization taught me how to break a different type of mind, how to exploit a different set of cultural values and psychological weaknesses, and now I'm here, addressing a chamber that contains representatives of every single type of civilization I learned to destroy." The silence that followed was not just quiet, it was the silence of a tomb. Because every delegate in the chamber was beginning to understand that they weren't witnessing a trial. They were witnessing the opening gambit of something far worse. 43 years, Marcus continued conversationally. "That's how long I spent among those 7 worlds, learning how to break them. But I wasn't working alone. While I was conducting field research, other humans were studying every species in the galactic community. Your histories, your cultures, your religions, your philosophies, your fears, your dreams, your social structures, your decision-making processes, everything." "That's impossible," protested Valtharan. "Such comprehensive intelligence gathering would require thousands of operatives working across hundreds of worlds for decades." "Someone would have noticed." "Someone did notice," Marcus agreed. "Several someones, in fact. They noticed humans integrating remarkably well into galactic society. They noticed us being unusually interested in local customs and traditions. They noticed how quickly we learned languages and cultural norms. They noticed how well liked we were, how trusted, how respected. The horror of it began to dawn on them. Humans hadn't been infiltrating galactic society. They had been welcomed with open arms. Every species had been eager to share their knowledge and culture with the fascinating new addition to the galactic community. The humans' curiosity and adaptability had been seen as charming traits, evidence of their potential as galactic citizens. "You've been studying us since first contact," Zixthara said, her voice hollow with realization. "Since before first contact," Marcus corrected. "We knew you were coming long before you made yourselves known. We'd been monitoring your communications, studying your behavior patterns, analyzing your social structures. By the time you officially introduced yourselves to humanity, we already understood you better than you understood yourselves." "Impossible," Kethmore repeated, but his voice lacked conviction now. "Our technology is far more advanced than yours. Our communications are encrypted with quantum-level security." "Your technology is more advanced," Marcus agreed, "but technology has limits. It can be hacked, bypassed, or simply observed from the outside. Psychology doesn't have those limits. Once you understand how a mind works, how it makes decisions, how it prioritizes values and weighs options, you don't need to break their encryption. You just need to make them want to tell you everything." The truth of it was undeniable. Every delegate in the chamber could think of human friends, colleagues, or acquaintances who had shown such genuine interest in their culture, their history, their personal experiences. Humans who had asked such thoughtful questions, listened so attentively, shown such respect for traditions and customs. It had been flattering, endearing, evidence of humanity's potential as a partner species. Now they realized they had been specimens under observation. 53 years of friendship, Thisan said, her telepathic abilities finally giving her glimpses of the vast network of deception and manipulation that had been woven around every aspect of galactic civilization. 53 years of trust and cooperation and cultural exchange. All of it was a lie. Not all of it, Marcus said, and for the first time there seemed to be something genuine in his voice. Some humans really do find your cultures fascinating. Some really do value the friendships they've formed. Some really do believe in the ideals of galactic cooperation and mutual understanding. Those humans weren't chosen for this mission. The simple statement hit the chamber like a physical blow, because it revealed something that was perhaps even more terrifying than the scope of the deception. It revealed that humanity had planned this from the very beginning. They had known, from the moment of first contact, that some of their people would be used for intelligence gathering and manipulation, while others would be kept innocent of the larger plan. They had been willing to sacrifice the genuine relationships and real friendships that some humans had formed, all in service of a strategy that spanned more than half a century. "What do you want?" Zixthara asked, her voice barely audible.
"Want?" Marcus seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. "I don't want anything."
"I've already achieved everything I came here to accomplish." "Which is?" Marcus gestured around the chamber again. "This moment. This realization. This understanding. You see, the 7 worlds I destroyed were never the real target. They were just the demonstration. The proof that one human working alone could manipulate entire civilizations into extinction using nothing but psychological manipulation." He began to pace again, his restraints adjusting to accommodate the movement. But what if it wasn't just one human? What if it was thousands? What if every human who had integrated into galactic society over the past 53 years was part of a coordinated plan to understand, analyze, and ultimately control every aspect of how your civilizations function? The delegates began to look around the chamber with new eyes, and what they saw there was terrifying. Because they weren't just looking at representatives of their own species. They were looking at beings who had spent decades forming relationships with humans, trusting humans, sharing their deepest cultural secrets and personal vulnerabilities with humans. "How many?" Kethmore asked quietly. "How many what?" Marcus replied. "How many of us are already compromised? How many of the beings in this chamber have shared enough with humans to make them vulnerable to the same kind of manipulation you used on those 7 worlds?" Marcus smiled again, and this time the expression was filled with something that might have been pity. "All of you." The 2 words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of realization that spread throughout the chamber, because every delegate present had interacted with humans over the years. Every one of them had formed relationships, shared cultural information, discussed their beliefs and values and fears with human friends or colleagues. Every one of them had trusted humanity enough to reveal the very psychological and cultural weaknesses that could now be used against them. "This is why I'm here," Marcus continued. "Not to be judged for destroying 7 worlds, but to inform you that the real work is just beginning. Right now, as we speak, humans across the galaxy are beginning to implement what they've learned from 53 years of observation and analysis. But unlike my work with the 7 worlds, this won't be individual manipulation of isolated civilizations." He stopped pacing and faced the assembled delegates directly. "This will be coordinated, simultaneous, species-wide psychological warfare against every member of the galactic community. And unlike those 7 worlds, you won't even realize it's happening until it's too late to stop it." The chamber erupted into chaos once again, but this time it was different. This time it wasn't the chaos of outrage or indignation. It was the chaos of panic, because every delegate was beginning to realize that they might already be living in the opening stages of the very manipulation Marcus was describing. How many conversations with humans had subtly influenced their thinking? How many suggestions from human colleagues had shaped their decisions? How many cultural exchanges had actually been intelligence-gathering operations designed to map their psychological vulnerabilities? The questions multiplied like a virus, infecting every memory of human interaction, every moment of trust and friendship and cooperation. And the most terrifying part was that there was no way to know which interactions had been genuine and which had been part of the plan. Through the chaos, Marcus remained perfectly calm, watching the destruction of galactic civilization's peace of mind with the same detached interest he might show for a mildly entertaining hologram. Because this was what he had come here to accomplish, not his own trial, but the trial of every assumption the galaxy had made about the nature of intelligence, cooperation, and trust. The humans stood bound in quantum chains, but the galactic court was falling into a silence that might well be eternal. And somewhere in the depths of space, on hundreds of worlds and thousands of space stations, other humans were receiving the signal to begin the next phase of a plan that had been 53 years in the making. The chaos in the chamber had evolved beyond mere panic into something approaching collective madness. Delegates who had sat together peacefully for decades were now eyeing each other with suspicion, wondering if their colleagues might have been compromised by human manipulation. The Veltari contingent had begun emitting stress pheromones so potent that several nearby species were being affected by secondary psychological trauma. The ethereals had contracted their gaseous forms to barely a tenth of their normal size, while the crystalline Zephyrians were shifting through color spectrums that indicated complete psychological breakdown. Through it all, Marcus Chen stood motionless in his quantum restraints, a figure of impossible calm in the center of a storm he had created with nothing more than words. His expression was not one of triumph or satisfaction, but of clinical observation, as if he were a researcher watching the results of a particularly interesting experiment. High Arbiter Zixthara's crystalline form had lost almost all of its luminescence, her rainbow refractions reduced to pale, sickly patterns that spoke of profound systemic shock. When she finally managed to speak, her voice carried undertones that the translation system struggled to process. "Security Protocol 9, she whispered, then louder. "Security Protocol 9, seal the chamber. No communications in or out." The chamber's walls immediately shifted from their normal transparent aluminum to an opaque, energy-absorbing material that would prevent any form of signal transmission. Emergency bulkheads slammed into place with resounding metallic clangs that echoed through the suddenly enclosed space. The delegates were now trapped together, cut off from the outside galaxy, with the human who had just announced the beginning of their civilization's end. "An interesting choice," Marcus observed, his tone suggesting mild approval, but ultimately pointless. The isolation protocol was designed to prevent information from leaving the chamber, but the information that matters has already been transmitted. "What do you mean?" Zixthara demanded, her form flickering weakly. "My presence here was the signal," Marcus explained patiently. "The moment I was brought into this chamber, every human operative in the galaxy knew it was time to begin. You've been so focused on preventing me from communicating with the outside that you failed to consider that my capture itself was the communication." Arbiter Thysan, her telepathic abilities now operating at maximum intensity despite the psychic dampeners, suddenly recoiled as if struck. "He's telling the truth," she gasped. "I can sense, oh, ancestors preserve us, I can sense the certainty in him. This was always the plan. Everything we've done, every decision we've made, it's all been anticipated." "Impossible," Kethmore snarled, his scarred carapace shifting to the deep red that indicated combat readiness among his species. No species could plan so far ahead, account for so many variables. "The future is chaotic, unpredictable. Not if you're the one controlling the variables," Marcus replied. "Tell me, Kethmore, how did you feel about the Terran Integration Accords 15 years ago? Were you in favor of allowing humanity expanded rights within the galactic community?" The Chronex warrior's color deepened to an even more violent shade of red. I supported the expansion. The humans had proven themselves to be valuable allies, contributing members of galactic society. "And who influenced that decision? Who provided the information and cultural context that helped you reach that conclusion?" Kethmore's silence was answer enough. Even he was beginning to remember the human military advisors who had worked so closely with Chronex forces, sharing tactical innovations and battlefield philosophies that had impressed his people. Humans who had understood the Chronex value system so perfectly that their suggestions had seemed like natural extensions of Chronex thinking. "The Proxima trade regulations of 8 years ago," Marcus continued, turning to address different sections of the chamber. "The Cultural Exchange Standardization Treaty of 12 years ago. The Shared Defense Initiative of 6 years ago. The Resource Allocation Protocols of 3 years ago. Every major decision this tribunal has made in the past 2 decades has been influenced, guided, and ultimately controlled by human input." The delegates began to look around the chamber with growing horror, because they could all remember those decisions. They could all remember the human advisors, diplomats, and cultural liaisons who had provided such valuable insights during the debates, humans who had understood each species' perspective so well that their contributions had seemed indispensable. "We're not just governing the galaxy anymore," whispered Veltheron, the plant-based record keeper whose species had maintained the tribunal's archives for millennia. "We're rubber-stamping decisions that humans made for us." "Now you're beginning to understand," Marcus said approvingly, "but you're still thinking too small. This isn't about controlling the tribunal's decisions. That was just the first step. The real objective was to use the tribunal's authority to reshape galactic civilization according to human priorities." "What priorities?" Zixthara asked, though her voice suggested she was afraid to hear the answer. "Efficiency," Marcus replied simply. the elimination of waste, redundancy, and inefficiency on a galactic scale. You see, from a human perspective, the current state of galactic civilization is profoundly wasteful. 347 different species, each with their own worlds, their own cultures, their own approaches to technology and society. Massive duplication of effort, constant conflicts over resources and territory, endless debates about cultural differences and philosophical incompatibilities. He began to pace again, his restraints allowing him a few steps in each direction. Humans look at this diversity and see inefficiency. We see a galaxy where billions of beings are spending their lives maintaining cultural traditions that serve no practical purpose, worshiping gods that don't exist, following social customs that impede progress, and engaging in political systems that prioritize consensus over results. "Diversity is strength," protested one of the ethereal delegates, their gaseous form pulsing with agitation. Different perspectives, different approaches to problems, different ways of understanding the universe. These things make us stronger as a galactic community. "Do they?" Marcus asked. "Then why are you all so easy to manipulate? Why was I able to convince 7 different types of civilization to destroy themselves using 7 different lies? If diversity was truly strength, shouldn't at least one of those civilizations have been immune to psychological manipulation?" The question hung in the air like a toxin because the answer was obvious and terrible. The very psychological and cultural differences that the galaxy celebrated as diversity were actually vulnerabilities, predictable patterns of thinking and behavior that could be exploited by anyone who understood them well enough. "The human approach to the galaxy," Marcus continued, "is fundamentally different from yours. We don't see 347 civilizations. We see 347 problems to be solved. Cultural traditions that need to be streamlined, belief systems that need to be rationalized, social structures that need to be optimized. Eliminated? The word came from multiple delegates simultaneously, spoken in dozens of different languages but carrying the same universal horror. Not through violence, Marcus clarified, as if that made it better. Through evolution, guided evolution, natural selection operating under human direction to produce optimal results. Some species will be enhanced, their useful traits preserved and improved. Others will be absorbed, integrated into more successful civilizations where their unique capabilities can be put to better use. And some, he paused, letting the implications settle. Some will simply be allowed to fade away, like those 7 worlds I destroyed. Not through force, but through choice, through careful manipulation of their cultural values and social structures until they conclude, on their own, that their time has passed. Thison's telepathic scream echoed through the minds of every psychically sensitive being in the chamber, a wordless cry of anguish and fury that left several delegates writhing in their seats. "You're talking about the systematic destruction of galactic civilization, the elimination of billions of years of cultural evolution. I'm talking about the systematic optimization of galactic civilization," Marcus corrected. "The preservation of what works and the elimination of what doesn't. From a human perspective, this is the most compassionate approach possible. Rather than allowing inefficient civilizations to struggle and suffer and eventually collapse on their own, as all inefficient systems eventually do, we're offering them the opportunity to contribute to something greater than themselves before they disappear." "And what makes humans qualified to determine what's efficient and what isn't?" demanded Kethmore, his warrior's pride finally overcoming his growing fear. "What gives your species the right to judge the worth of civilizations that existed for millions of years before humans even evolved?" Marcus smiled again, and this time the expression was filled with something that was definitely pity. "The same thing that gave those 7 worlds the right to exist in the first place, the ability to survive. Darwin's law, Kethmore, natural selection. The strong survive, the weak perish, and the definition of strong changes with the environment." He gestured around the chamber with his chin. "For millions of years, your civilizations were strong because they could adapt to their physical environments, develop technology, explore space, form alliances, but the environment has changed. Now, the definition of strong includes the ability to resist psychological manipulation, to maintain cultural cohesion in the face of systematic deception, to make rational decisions when your fundamental assumptions about reality are under attack." The silence that followed was profound, because every delegate in the chamber was beginning to understand that they were living through an extinction event, not a physical catastrophe, but something far more insidious. The rules of survival had changed, and they were only now realizing how thoroughly unprepared they were for the new reality. "How long?" Valthoran asked quietly. "How long do we have before humans begin implementing this optimization?" Begin, Marcus laughed, a sound that somehow managed to be both musical and terrifying. My dear Valtherin, we began 53 years ago with first contact. We've been implementing optimization protocols throughout your entire relationship with humanity. The only thing that changes now is that you're aware of it. The implication hit the chamber like a meteor impact. 53 years of cultural exchange, technological cooperation, diplomatic negotiation, and social integration, all of it had been part of a systematic process of analysis, manipulation, and gradual transformation. Every delegate present had been living their entire adult lives within a human-designed system of control. The trade agreements that seemed so beneficial to your species, Marcus continued conversationally, actually created economic dependencies that give humans leverage over your resource allocation. The cultural exchange programs that brought your people and humans together weren't just about mutual understanding. They were about identifying the most influential members of your societies and either recruiting them as assets or mapping their psychological profiles for future manipulation. He turned to face different sections of the chamber as he spoke, addressing each species directly. The technological sharing initiatives that seemed like evidence of human generosity were actually data-gathering operations designed to understand your manufacturing capabilities, resource requirements, and infrastructure vulnerabilities. The joint military exercises that seemed like cooperative defense planning were actually intelligence operations designed to understand your tactical doctrines, weapon systems, and strategic thinking patterns. Each revelation hit the delegates like a physical blow because they could all remember participating in these programs. They could all remember feeling grateful for human cooperation, impressed by human innovation, moved by human friendship. Now they were realizing that every positive interaction with humanity had been part of an intelligence-gathering operation that spanned more than half a century. Even this tribunal, Marcus said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, has been shaped by human influence. The legal precedents established in cases involving human defendants, the procedural changes suggested by human legal advisors, the philosophical frameworks introduced through human cultural liaisons, all of it designed to create a legal system that would ultimately serve human interests. Zixthera's form was now so dim that she was barely visible, her crystalline structure seeming to fade in real time. You're saying that we've been living in a human-designed prison for 53 years without knowing it. I'm saying you've been living in a human-designed optimization program for 53 years without recognizing it, Marcus corrected. And the beautiful thing is, from your perspective, it's been largely beneficial. Crime rates down across the galaxy, economic prosperity up. Technological advancement accelerating, cultural conflicts decreasing. By every metric you use to measure the success of galactic civilization, things have been getting better since humans joined the community. Because you've been manipulating the metrics, Tissan said, her telepathic abilities finally breaking through enough of the dampening field to sense the vast scope of what had been done. You've been guiding us toward definitions of success that serve human purposes. Exactly, Marcus said, his approval genuine. And that's why what comes next will be so effective. Because when we begin the final phase of optimization, we won't be imposing an alien system on unwilling subjects. We'll be helping you achieve the goals you've already accepted, using the methods you've already endorsed, following the logic you've already internalized. What is the final phase? Kethmore asked, his voice barely audible. Marcus's smile was radiant with anticipation. Integration. The single word fell into the silence like a stone into still water, sending ripples of realization throughout the chamber. Because suddenly, every delegate understood what had been planned from the beginning. Not conquest, not destruction, not even domination, something far more complete and far more terrifying. The systematic absorption of galactic civilization into a human-designed collective, where every species, every culture, every individual would have their place and purpose determined by human priorities. Where diversity would be preserved only to the extent that it served human goals, and where the very concept of independent civilization would become as extinct as the 7 worlds Marcus had already destroyed. And the most terrifying part of all was that when it happened, most beings would welcome it as the natural next step in galactic evolution. The word integration continued to echo through the sealed chamber. Not as sound, for the acoustic dampeners had absorbed its physical vibrations within seconds, but as a concept that seemed to take on a life of its own in the minds of the delegates. It writhed through their consciousness like a parasite, forcing them to confront implications they had never imagined and possibilities they had never feared. Marcus Chen observed their mental anguish with the detached fascination of an entomologist watching insects under glass. His quantum restraints pulsed with contained energy, but the most dangerous thing in the room remained his voice, his words, his ability to transform understanding into horror with nothing more than patient explanation. Integration, he repeated, savoring the way the word made several delegates physically recoil. not assimilation. That implies force, coercion, the destruction of individual identity. Integration is far more elegant. It's the voluntary merger of compatible systems, the natural evolution of cooperation into unity, the logical endpoint of successful diplomacy. Arbiter Tisan, her telepathic abilities operating at their maximum despite the psychic dampeners, suddenly doubled over in her chair as if struck by a physical blow. "I can see it," she gasped, her voice barely audible through the universal translators. "Fragments, pieces, the shape of what you've planned. Oh, ancestors, forgive us. I can see what you've done to our futures. Don't be so dramatic," Marcus chided gently. "You're seeing potential outcomes based on current trajectory patterns. Nothing is inevitable, except that which has already been set in motion through collective choice." High Arbiter Zixara's crystalline form flickered weakly as she struggled to maintain her composure. "Explain integration," she commanded, though her voice carried none of its former authority. "Tell us exactly what you mean." "Gladly," Marcus replied, beginning his measured pace once more. "Integration begins with recognition. The acknowledgement that current galactic civilization, despite its surface prosperity, is fundamentally unsustainable. Too many competing interests, too many inefficient redundancies, too many resources wasted on maintaining artificial distinctions between species that could be working toward common goals." He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "The Veltari, for example, have developed remarkable biotechnology that could revolutionize medicine across hundreds of worlds. But they guard their secrets jealously, sharing only limited applications through carefully controlled trade agreements. Meanwhile, the Zephyrians have mastered energy manipulation techniques that could solve resource scarcity for entire sectors. But they use these abilities primarily for artistic expression and cultural ceremonies." Several delegates began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing the accuracy of his observations while simultaneously understanding that he was building towards something terrible. "From a human perspective," Marcus continued, "this represents catastrophic misallocation of resources. Billions of beings suffer from diseases that could be cured, live in poverty that could be eliminated, die in conflicts that could be prevented, all because the beings with the knowledge and ability to solve these problems are more interested in maintaining their cultural identity than in maximizing utility." "Cultural identity is not a luxury," protested one of the Veltari delegates, their chitinous form clicking with agitation. "It is the foundation of who we are, the source of our values and our purpose." "Is it?" Marcus asked mildly. "Or is it simply a collection of arbitrary traditions that you've been conditioned to value through millions of years of evolutionary selection? Tell me, if your biotechnology could save 1 trillion lives across the galaxy, but sharing it required abandoning some of your cultural practices, wouldn't the moral choice be obvious?" The question hung in the air like poison gas, because it forced the Veltari delegate to choose between their deepest values and logical compassion. And everyone in the chamber could see that there was no good answer. Either choice would require sacrificing something fundamental to their identity. "That's a false dichotomy," Kethmore growled, his scarred carapace shifting through colors that indicated both anger and uncertainty. "You're creating artificial constraints to force impossible choices. I'm revealing existing constraints that you've chosen to ignore," Marcus corrected. "Every resource spent maintaining cultural distinctiveness is a resource not spent solving galactic problems. Every bit of knowledge hoarded for the sake of species pride is knowledge that could be saving lives. Every tradition preserved for its own sake is a tradition that might be preventing progress towards solutions that benefit everyone." The logic was inexorable and horrible because it was built on foundations that most galactic civilizations had accepted as obviously true. The value of life, the importance of reducing suffering, the moral imperative to help others when possible, these were core principles shared across virtually every species in the chamber. Marcus was simply following those principles to their logical conclusion, and that conclusion was the obliteration of everything they held dear. "Integration," Marcus continued, "offers a solution that preserves what matters while eliminating what doesn't. Instead of the Veltari hoarding their biotechnology, they become part of a larger medical research collective where their expertise is amplified by the knowledge and resources of hundreds of other species. Instead of the Zephyrians using their energy manipulation for art, they become part of a galactic infrastructure project that brings prosperity to billions." "And what happens to the Veltari who don't want to be part of your medical collective?" asked Valtheron, the plant-based record-keeper whose species had maintained their independence for longer than most civilizations had existed. "What happens to the Zephyrians who believe their art is more important than your infrastructure projects?" Marcus's expression grew thoughtful, as if he were considering the question for the first time. They're free to make that choice, of course. No one will be forced into integration, but they'll have to live with the consequences of that choice. What consequences? Natural selection, Marcus replied simply. Species that choose inefficiency over optimization, cultural purity over collective benefit, traditional methods over superior alternatives. They'll find themselves increasingly isolated from the mainstream of galactic civilization. Their worlds will become backwaters. Their people will emigrate to more prosperous integrated communities. Their knowledge and traditions will gradually fade into irrelevance. The horror of it was in the casualness with which he described the death of entire civilizations. No violence, no conquest, no dramatic destruction. Just the slow, inevitable process of being left behind by progress, of choosing extinction through relevance rather than survival through adaptation. You're talking about genocide through obsolescence, this Anne whispered, her telepathic abilities showing her glimpses of empty worlds, abandoned cities, the last members of species that had chosen cultural purity over integration dying alone in museums of their own making. I'm talking about evolution, Marcus corrected. The same process that has shaped every species in this galaxy since the beginning of time. The only difference is that now the selection pressure is psychological and cultural rather than purely physical. He stopped pacing and faced the assembled delegates directly. But here's the beautiful part. It doesn't have to be traumatic. Integration can be as gradual or as rapid as each species chooses. Those who embrace the process early will find themselves in leadership positions within the new galactic order, their knowledge and capabilities amplified by human organizational skills and strategic thinking. Those who resist will have the opportunity to observe the benefits of integration and make their own informed choice about when to join. And those who never join? Zixthera asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. They'll have the satisfaction of maintaining their cultural purity right up until the moment they cease to exist, Marcus said with something that might have been genuine sympathy, which, from their perspective, is probably preferable to the alternative. The silence that followed was profound and terrible, because every delegate in the chamber was beginning to understand that they were witnessing the end of galactic civilization as they knew it. Not through war or natural disaster, but through a process so gradual and seemingly voluntary that most beings would never realize what was happening until it was too late to stop. When? Kethmore asked finally, his warrior's pragmatism cutting through the philosophical horror. When does this integration begin? It began 53 years ago, Marcus replied patiently. What you're really asking is when it becomes obvious, when the voluntary nature of the process becomes apparent to everyone involved. And the answer is now. This moment. As if summoned by his words, the chamber's emergency communication system suddenly activated despite the security lockdown. A holographic display materialized above the assembled delegates, showing incoming priority messages from across the galaxy. The seal that was supposed to prevent all communication had somehow been bypassed, and information was flooding in from hundreds of worlds. Impossible, Zixthara breathed, her crystalline form flickering as she processed the incoming data. The isolation protocol is absolute. Nothing can breach those barriers. Nothing galactic, Marcus agreed, watching the delegates' reactions with obvious satisfaction. But human technology operates on different principles than galactic technology. We've had 53 years to study your systems, understand their limitations, develop countermeasures. The holographic display began showing reports from across galactic space, and the pattern that emerged was both subtle and terrifying. On world after world, human advisors and cultural liaisons were beginning to suggest new policies, new approaches to governance, new solutions to long-standing problems. The suggestions were reasonable, logical, clearly beneficial to the species involved. They were also coordinated, synchronized, and obviously part of a larger plan that spanned the entire galaxy. The Regellian Council is considering a proposal to share their agricultural technology with neighboring systems, one of the reports indicated. Human agricultural specialists have demonstrated how this could increase food production by 300% across 14 worlds. The Andromedan Defense Force is evaluating a human-designed integration protocol for their military command structure, another report stated. Preliminary analysis suggests this could improve response times and tactical effectiveness by 40%. The Centaurian Trade Federation has received a comprehensive economic optimization plan from human financial advisors, a third report announced. Implementation could increase prosperity across the entire sector while reducing resource conflicts by 60%. Report after report painted the same picture. Across hundreds of worlds, human advisors were simultaneously presenting solutions to local problems, solutions that would require integration with human-designed systems, human-led organizations, human-controlled networks. Each proposal was perfectly tailored to the specific species involved, addressing their unique concerns while gradually drawing them into the larger web of integration. "Magnificent," Thisan whispered, her telepathic abilities allowing her to sense the vast scope of coordination involved. "The entire operation is synchronized down to the minute. Every human advisor in the galaxy is making their move at exactly the same time. Timing is important in operations of this scale," Marcus agreed. "Too early, and Resistance has time to organize. Too late, and the element of surprise is lost. But at exactly the right moment, when the evidence is undeniable but the process is too far advanced to stop," he gestured toward the holographic display, which was now showing real-time responses from across galactic space. And those responses were exactly what Marcus had predicted. Initial surprise giving way to consideration, consideration giving way to cautious acceptance, acceptance giving way to enthusiastic endorsement. Because the proposals were genuinely beneficial, the solutions were actually superior to existing methods. The integration protocols really would improve efficiency, reduce conflicts, and increase prosperity. The only cost was the gradual erosion of species independence, the slow transformation of diverse galactic civilization into something unified, coordinated, and ultimately controlled by human strategic thinking. "They're saying yes," Valtheron observed, her plant-based nervous system processing the incoming data with growing horror. "Across the galaxy? Our people are saying yes to integration?" "Of course they are," Marcus replied. "Why would they say no? We're offering them everything they want, solutions to their problems, improvements to their lives, prosperity for their children, security for their futures. The only thing we're asking in return is that they trust us to coordinate these improvements on a galactic scale." "Trust," Kethmore repeated, the word bitter in his translator's rendering. "Trust the species that spent 53 years lying to us about everything. Trust the species that spent 53 years learning how to give you everything you actually want," Marcus corrected. "That's the difference between conquest and integration. Conquest imposes the will of the strong on the weak, but integration gives everyone what they really desire while organizing it efficiently." The reports continued streaming in, and the pattern became clearer with each new data point. Humanity wasn't demanding submission or threatening violence. They were offering genuine improvements to galactic civilization, coordinated through human expertise and organizational capability. The integration was voluntary, beneficial, and practically irresistible, and that was what made it so terrifying. Because faced with the choice between maintaining their independence while watching their neighbors prosper through human-guided integration, or joining the process and accepting the gradual transformation of their civilization, most species were making the rational choice. They were choosing survival, prosperity, and progress over cultural purity and species independence. They were choosing to become part of something larger than themselves, something more efficient and more capable than anything they could achieve alone. They were choosing integration. The representatives of 347 species watched their civilization transform in real time, understanding finally that they weren't judges presiding over the trial of a war criminal. They were witnesses to the peaceful conquest of the galaxy by a species that had never needed to fire a single shot. The holographic displays continued their relentless stream of information, painting a picture of galactic transformation that was as methodical as it was irreversible. Each incoming report showed the same pattern repeating across hundreds of worlds. Human advisors presenting solutions, local governments considering proposals, populations embracing changes that promised prosperity and security. Within hours of Marcus's revelation, the process of integration had shifted from shadow operation to galactic reality. Marcus Chen stood at the center of it all, his quantum restraint still pulsing with lethal energy. Yet somehow he seemed less like a prisoner and more like a conductor orchestrating the greatest symphony in galactic history. His expression remained calm, almost serene, as he watched the representatives of 347 species grapple with the realization that their civilization was being transformed before their eyes. "Stop it," High Arbiter Zixthara whispered, her crystalline form now so dim it was barely visible in the chamber's lighting. "Stop the reports. We can't watch this anymore." "Stop truth?" Marcus asked mildly. "Stop reality? What you're seeing isn't propaganda or deception. It's simply what's happening right now across the galaxy as the logical result of 53 years of careful preparation meeting the moment of decision." "This isn't decision," protested Kethmore, though his voice lacked the fierce conviction that had characterized his earlier objections. "This is manipulation on a scale that defies comprehension." You've created conditions where acceptance seems rational, while resistance appears foolish. I've created conditions where acceptance is rational and resistance is foolish, Marcus corrected. The manipulation was in the setup, Cathmore. The 53 years of relationship building, trust establishment, and cultural analysis that brought us to this moment. What's happening now is simply choice, informed by accurate information and realistic assessment of alternatives. The Chronic's warrior's scarred carapace had faded to a dull gray that indicated profound psychological exhaustion among his species. You've eliminated meaningful choice by making only one option truly viable. I've eliminated destructive choice by making the optimal option clearly superior, Marcus replied. If your world was offered a solution that would end resource conflicts, eliminate poverty, prevent wars, and guarantee prosperity for your descendants, while the only cost was accepting coordination with other species working toward the same goals, would refusing that offer be a meaningful choice, or would it be irrational self-destruction? The question hung in the air like a trap, because everyone in the chamber could see both sides of the logic. From an individual perspective, refusing integration meant choosing hardship, isolation, and eventual irrelevance. From a species perspective, it meant sacrificing everything that made them unique for the promise of efficiency and prosperity. There should be a third option, said Valtheron, her plant-based nervous system processing the philosophical implications with the methodical precision of her species. Some path that preserves both independence and prosperity, that allows for cooperation without requiring integration. There was, Marcus agreed. 53 years of it, in fact. The galactic community had more than half a century to develop such alternatives, to create systems that balanced independence with cooperation, to build structures that maximized benefit while respecting autonomy. He gestured toward the holographic displays with his chin, his restraints preventing more elaborate movement. This is the result. 53 years of trying to maintain independence while cooperating led to the current state of galactic civilization, inefficient, conflict-ridden, wasteful, and ultimately unsustainable. The third option was tested and found wanting. Arbiter Thisan, her telepathic abilities now operating at their absolute maximum despite the psychic dampeners, suddenly straightened in her chair as if struck by lightning. "You're not just integrating civilizations," she gasped, her mental perception finally grasping the full scope of what was unfolding. "You're integrating the concept of integration itself. You're making it so that the very idea of independent civilization becomes psychologically impossible to maintain." "Very good," Marcus said, his approval genuine and warm. "You're beginning to see the elegance of the complete design. Physical integration, the merging of systems, technologies, and resources, is only the first layer. Cultural integration follows the adoption of common values, shared goals, and unified social structures, but the deepest layer is psychological integration, the transformation of how beings think about identity, belonging, and purpose." The horror of it began to dawn on the assembled delegates as they realized what Thisan had perceived. This wasn't just about changing how galactic civilization operated. It was about changing how galactic citizens thought about the very concept of civilization itself. Future generations wouldn't just accept integration as the optimal choice. They would be incapable of conceiving meaningful alternatives. "You're rewriting the psychology of intelligence itself," whispered one of the ethereal delegates, their gaseous form contracting to a point that suggested they were on the verge of consciousness collapse. "You're not just conquering our bodies and minds, you're conquering our capacity to imagine freedom. I'm optimizing the psychological substrate of galactic civilization to eliminate destructive concepts that lead to inefficiency and suffering," Marcus replied, his tone suggesting that the distinction was important to him. Freedom, as traditionally conceived by galactic species, includes the freedom to make choices that harm others, waste resources, perpetuate conflicts, and resist solutions to preventable problems. That kind of freedom is a luxury that galactic civilization can no longer afford. "Says who?" Cathmore demanded, his warrior's instincts finally overriding his growing despair. "What gives humans the right to determine what galactic civilization can and cannot afford?" "The same thing that gives any species any rights," Marcus replied simply. "The ability to make our determinations stick. Natural selection, social evolution, the fundamental law that governs all life in the universe. The strong survive, define the rules, and shape the future according to their vision." He began pacing again, his movement now taking on an almost hypnotic quality as the chamber's occupants found themselves following his words with the stunned fascination of beings witnessing their own extinction. "Humans are strong in ways that matter for the current environment." We're better at long-term planning, more effective at psychological manipulation, more capable of coordinating complex operations across vast scales of space and time. These advantages make us the natural inheritors of galactic leadership, just as your advantages in technology and space travel made you the natural inheritors of your respective planetary systems. But we didn't extinguish the species that came before us, protested Valtheron. We preserved them, integrated them into our civilizations as valued members of our societies. Because you could afford to, Marcus pointed out. Your pre-spaceflight species weren't capable of developing interstellar weapons or forming alliances with other worlds. They weren't existential threats to your expansion and development, but galactic civilization as it currently exists is an existential threat to optimal resource utilization and long-term stability. It must be transformed or it will eventually destroy itself through inefficiency and conflict. The logic was airtight and absolutely terrifying. Marcus was describing the peaceful extinction of galactic civilization not as conquest or destruction, but as evolution, the natural replacement of less efficient systems with more effective alternatives. And the most horrifying part was that he was probably right. The reports are slowing down, observed Zixthara, her dim form flickering as she processed the incoming data streams. Fewer worlds are responding to the integration proposals. Not fewer, Marcus corrected. Faster. The early responses were from worlds that needed extensive deliberation to reach their decisions. But as more worlds accept integration, the psychological pressure on the remaining holdouts intensifies. Social proof, network effects, fear of isolation, all working together to accelerate the decision-making process. The holographic display confirmed his analysis. The rate of new integration agreements was actually increasing, as species after species concluded that joining the process was preferable to being left behind. What had started as careful consideration was becoming a stampede, as entire sectors of galactic space shifted from independence to human-coordinated integration within hours. "How many?" asked Keth more quietly. "How many what?" Marcus replied. "How many will resist until the end? How many species will choose extinction over integration?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, apparently considering the question seriously. "Fewer than you might expect," he said finally. "Most species are fundamentally rational when presented with accurate information about their options. They'll choose survival and prosperity over cultural purity when the stakes are clearly defined. But some will resist. Some will resist," Marcus agreed. "Species with psychological structures that make integration genuinely impossible for them, cultures that would rather die than change, individuals who value their identity more than their lives, they'll have that choice, and it will be honored." "Honored," repeated Tissan, her telepathic abilities finally breaking through enough of the psychic dampening to sense something like genuine regret in Marcus's mind. "You almost sound like you respect them." "I do respect them," Marcus said. And for the first time since entering the chamber, his voice carried what might have been genuine emotion. Choosing extinction over compromise requires a kind of courage that humans find admirable. It's not rational, not optimal, not beneficial to anyone involved, but it's authentically heroic in a way that integration never can be. The admission hung in the air like a gift, offering the delegates their first glimpse of something human beyond the cold logic of optimization and efficiency. It was a small thing. Barely a crack in the armor of absolute certainty Marcus had worn throughout his revelation, but it suggested that somewhere beneath the strategic thinking and psychological manipulation, something recognizably individual still existed. "Is that what you want us to do?" asked Zixthara, her crystalline form flickering with what might have been the faintest return of luminescence. "To choose heroic extinction over pragmatic integration?" Marcus was quiet for a very long time, his expression thoughtful as he watched the holographic displays showing the continuing transformation of galactic civilization. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than it had been at any point during the proceedings. "I want you to choose," he said simply. "Freely, with full knowledge of the consequences, based on what you genuinely value most." That's the one thing humans can't optimize away, the moment of authentic choice when a being decides what they're willing to sacrifice for what they believe in. And if we choose resistance, then you'll have the satisfaction of dying as yourselves, Marcus replied, unchanged, uncompromised, and ultimately irrelevant to the future of galactic civilization. It's not a rational choice, but it's an authentic one. And if we choose integration, then you'll have the satisfaction of contributing to something larger and more capable than anything your individual species could have achieved alone, Marcus said. Your knowledge and capabilities will be preserved and enhanced, your people will prosper in ways you never imagined possible, and your descendants will inherit a galaxy free from the conflicts and inefficiencies that have plagued civilization for millennia. It's the rational choice, but it requires sacrificing the illusion of independence. The silence that followed was different from all the others that had punctuated the proceedings. It was not the silence of shock or fear or even despair. It was the silence of beings confronting the most fundamental question any intelligent species could face. What did they value more, the preservation of their identity or the continuation of their existence? The tribunal has a choice to make, Marcus continued after the silence had stretched long enough to become profound. You can vote to condemn integration, declare humanity a threat to galactic civilization, and call for resistance across all member species. Your authority still carries enormous weight. Many worlds would listen to such a declaration, would choose to fight against the transformation I've described. And, prompted Zixthera, and within a generation those worlds would be museum pieces, preserved as curiosities for integrated citizens to study and remember. Their populations would emigrate to integrated territories, their technologies would become obsolete, their cultures would fade into historical footnotes, they would die slowly, quietly, peacefully, but they would die as themselves. He paused, letting the implication sink in. Or you can vote to accept integration, to guide your species through the transformation according to your own values and priorities. You can ensure that what matters most to each civilization is preserved and enhanced within the new galactic order. You can help determine how the future unfolds, rather than simply watching it happen from the sidelines. That's not really a choice, Kethmore said bitterly. That's surrender disguised as participation. It's evolution disguised as revolution, Marcus corrected. The same process that brought every species in this galaxy from primitive origins to galactic civilization, just operating on a larger scale and with conscious direction instead of random chance. The holographic displays showed that the pace of integration agreements was still accelerating. Sector after sector was accepting human coordination, their representatives expressing genuine enthusiasm for the opportunities being offered. The transformation of galactic civilization was no longer a theoretical possibility. It was an observable reality unfolding in real time. We need to vote, Zixthera said finally, her crystalline form barely visible but her voice carrying the weight of her office. The tribunal must reach a decision about how to respond to this situation. I'll make it easier for you, Marcus said, and for the first time since entering the chamber, he smiled with what appeared to be genuine warmth. I call for a vote of no confidence in my own trial. I move that this tribunal declare that the charges against me are irrelevant to the current situation, that the destruction of 7 worlds was a minor incident compared to the transformation currently taking place, and that the real question before us is not my guilt or innocence, but the future of galactic civilization itself. The audacity of it was breathtaking. A defendant calling for the dismissal of his own trial in order to focus on the larger implications of his actions. But it was also everyone in the chamber realized exactly the right response to their situation. The original charges seemed almost trivial now, compared to what they had learned about the scope of human planning and the reality of galactic transformation. Seconded, said Thassan quietly, her telepathic abilities showing her that the formal structure of the trial had become meaningless in the face of what they were actually discussing. The question of Marcus Chen's guilt is irrelevant to the question of how we respond to integration. All in favor? Zixthera asked, her voice barely audible. Every hand, appendage, pseudopod, and sensory organ in the chamber was raised. 347 species, represented by beings who had entered the chamber as judges, unanimously voted to abandon their role as arbiters of justice in order to become participants in a decision that would determine the fate of galactic civilization. The irony was not lost on Marcus, who watched the vote with obvious satisfaction. Very good. So the question before us now is simple. Do you choose to guide integration from within, or do you choose to resist it from without? What happens if we choose integration? Asked Valteran. What does that actually mean for our species, our worlds, our cultures? It means you become part of the planning process instead of subjects of it, Marcus replied. Your knowledge of your own species' psychology and culture becomes an asset in designing integration protocols that preserve what matters while optimizing what can be improved. You help determine how your people are incorporated into the larger galactic system rather than having that determination made for you by human planners who, however skilled, lack your insider understanding. And if we choose resistance, then you become irrelevant to the future of your own species, Marcus said bluntly. Integration will continue with or without your participation, because the benefits are too obvious and the alternatives too grim for most rational beings to reject. But without your guidance, the process will be designed entirely by human planners according to human priorities, with less consideration for preserving what you consider valuable about your civilizations. The logic was inexorable and terrible, because it meant that even resistance was ultimately self-defeating. By refusing to participate in integration, they would guarantee that integration happened in ways that were less favorable to their species' interests. Their only meaningful choice was between integration on terms they helped design and integration on terms designed for them. Vote, Zixthara said, her voice carrying the weight of 8,000 years of tribunal authority. All those in favor of guided integration with tribunal participation in the planning and implementation process. The response was not immediate. Each delegate struggled with the decision, weighing the preservation of their independence against the survival of their people, the maintenance of their cultural identity against the possibility of prosperity and security. It was the most difficult decision any of them had ever faced, because both alternatives required sacrificing something fundamental to who they were. But, one by one, hands began to rise, appendages lifted, optical sensors flashed agreement. Gaseous forms pulsed with acceptance. The vote was not unanimous. 17 species chose resistance, preferring extinction as themselves to survival as something else. But it was overwhelming. 330 species voted to participate in their own transformation. Motion carries, Zixthara announced, her crystalline form flickering one last time before going completely dark. The Galactic Tribunal votes to accept integration under human guidance with full participation in the planning and implementation process. Marcus nodded approvingly, and something in his expression suggested that this outcome had been anticipated from the beginning. "Thank you," he said simply. "You've made the rational choice, and your species will benefit from your wisdom." "What happens now?" asked Kethmore, his voice empty of everything but exhausted resignation. "Now you go home," Marcus replied. "You return to your worlds and your peoples, and you help them understand that the galaxy has changed, that the old ways of doing things are ending, and that the new ways offer opportunities they never imagined possible. You help them see that integration is not conquest but evolution, not destruction but transformation. And you?" Marcus looked down at his quantum restraints, then back at the assembled delegates. "I complete my mission. I return to Earth to report that the demonstration phase was successful, that galactic civilization has chosen evolution over extinction, and that the real work of integration can begin." "Just like that?" Thisan asked. "You walk away from the greatest crime in galactic history and return home as a hero?" "I walk away from the greatest success in galactic history," Marcus corrected gently. "The peaceful transformation of hundreds of civilizations without a single shot fired, without a single battle fought, without a single unnecessary death. In human terms, this is not a crime. It's the greatest diplomatic achievement in the history of intelligence. The quantum restraints began to power down, their energy fields dissipating as someone, presumably human security forces, who had been waiting for this moment, remotely deactivated the containment systems." Marcus rubbed his wrists casually as if he had been wearing nothing more restrictive than uncomfortable jewelry. "Ladies, gentlemen, and beings of various other classifications," he said, his tone taking on the quality of a formal farewell address. "It has been an honor to serve as your introduction to the future. When your descendants look back on this day, they will remember it not as the end of galactic independence, but as the beginning of galactic optimization." He began walking toward the chamber's exit, which opened smoothly at his approach despite the supposed security lockdown. "You have chosen to be part of something greater than yourselves, something more capable and more prosperous than anything you could have achieved alone. Your children will thank you for your wisdom." As he reached the threshold, Marcus paused and turned back one last time. "And for what it's worth," he added, his voice carrying what might have been genuine regret, "I'm sorry it had to be this way. In a perfect universe, evolution would be gentler, transformation would be optional, and species could maintain their independence while still achieving optimization. But we don't live in a perfect universe. We live in this one, where the strong survive and the weak are absorbed, where efficiency triumphs over tradition, where rational choice ultimately determines the shape of the future." "Will we see you again?" asked Zixthara, her crystalline form so dim it was barely perceptible. "Probably not," Marcus admitted. "My role in this process is complete. From now on, you'll be working with human integration specialists, cultural liaisons, and optimization experts who are far better suited to the practical work of transformation than I am." "What are you suited for?" asked Kethmore. Marcus smiled one last time, and the expression was filled with something that might have been anticipation. "Finding the next galaxy that needs optimization," he said simply. And then he was gone, walking out of the chamber and out of their lives, leaving behind 330 species that had voted to transform themselves, and 17 species that had chosen extinction over compromise. The Galactic Tribunal that had convened to judge a war criminal had instead become accomplices in the peaceful conquest of their own civilization. In the silence that followed his departure, the delegates sat in their darkened chamber, surrounded by holographic displays showing the continuing transformation of the galaxy, trying to come to terms with what they had just experienced. They had witnessed the end of one era and the beginning of another, the closing of a chapter in galactic history that had lasted for millennia, and the opening of a new chapter whose ending none of them could foresee. And somewhere in the depths of space, on worlds and stations across hundreds of systems, humans were beginning the practical work of integration, armed with 53 years of intelligence and the voluntary cooperation of species that had chosen optimization over independence. The human had stood bound in quantum chains, but the galactic court had fallen into a silence that would indeed prove eternal, not the silence of death, but the silence of transformation, the quiet that comes when one age ends and another begins, when the familiar patterns of existence give way to something unprecedented and unknowable. The trial was over. The integration had begun. And the galaxy would never be the same.